A Christmas ghost story with a twist. On a bustling Christmas Eve, John Mudbury, an ordinary man with an ordinary family, has been Christmas shopping. Under his arms he carries presents for his wife and 3 children. As he starts his journey home, the familiar streets of London give way to increasingly strange encounters. Mudbury navigates an increasingly bewildering series of events where the line between the familiar and the uncanny blurs. With each step, the veil between worlds grows thinner until he arrives home with presents in hand and finds things very strange indeed. I am Tony Walker, and this is Transition by Algernon Blackwood, a Christmas ghost story.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody dies.
Transition by Algernon Blackwood, a Christmas ghost story. John Mudbury was on his way home from the shops, his arms full of Christmas presents. It was after 6 o'clock and the streets were very crowded. He was an ordinary man, lived in an ordinary suburban flat with an ordinary wife and ordinary children. He didn't think them ordinary, but everybody else did. He had ordinary presents for each one, a cheap blotter for his wife, a cheap air gun for the boy, and so forth. He was over 50, bald, in an office, decent in mind and habits, of uncertain opinions, uncertain politics, and uncertain religion. Yet he considered himself a decided, positive gentleman, quite unaware that the morning newspaper determined his opinions for the day. He just lived from day to day. Physically, he was fit enough, except for a weak heart, which never troubled him, and his summer holiday was bad golf, while the children bathed and his wife read Garvice on the sands. Like the majority of men, he dreamed idly of the past, muddled away the present, and guessed vaguely, after imaginative reading on occasions, at the future. "I'd like to survive all right," he said, "provided it's better than this," surveying his wife and children and thinking of his daily toil. "Otherwise—" and he shrugged his shoulders, as a brave man should. He went to church regularly, but in church nothing convinced him that he did survive, just as nothing in church enticed him into hoping that he would. On the other hand, nothing in life persuaded him that he didn't, wouldn't, couldn't. "I'm an evolutionist," he loved to say to thoughtful cronies over a glass, having never heard that Darwinism had been questioned. And so he came home gaily, happily, with his bunch of Christmas presents, for the wife and little ones, stroking himself upon their keen enjoyment and excitement. The night before, he'd taken the wife to see Magic at a select London theatre where the intellectuals went, and had been extraordinarily stirred. He had gone questioningly, yet expecting something out of the common. "It's not musical," he warned her, "nor farce, nor comedy, so to speak." And in answer to her question as to what the critics had said, he had wriggled, sighed, and put his gaudy necktie straight 4 times in quick succession. For no man in the street, with any claim to self-respect, could be expected to understand what the critics had said, even if he understood the play. And John answered truthfully, "Oh, they just said things, but the theatre's always full, and that's the only test." And just now, as he crossed the crowded circus to catch his bus, it chanced that his mind, having glimpsed an advertisement, was full of this particular play, or rather of the effect it had produced upon him at the time. For it had thrilled him, inexplicably, with its marvellous speculative hint, its big audacity, its alert and spiritual beauty. Thought plunged to find something, plunged after this bizarre suggestion of a bigger universe, after this quasi-jocular suggestion that man is not the only, then dashed full tilt against a sentence that memory thrust beneath his nose. Science does not exhaust the universe, and at the same time dashed full tilt against destruction of another kind as well. How it happened, he never exactly knew. He saw a monster glaring at him with eyes of blazing fire. It was horrible. It rushed upon him. He dodged. Another monster met him round the corner. Both came at him simultaneously. He dodged again, a leap that might have cleared a hurdle easily. But it was too late. Between the pair of them, his heart literally in his gullet, he was mercilessly caught, bones crunched. There was a soft sensation, icy cold and hot as fire. Horns and voices roared, battering rams he saw, and a carapace of iron. Then, dazzling light. Always face the traffic, he remembered with a frantic yell, and by some extraordinary luck escaped miraculously onto the opposite pavement. There was no doubt about it. By the skin of his teeth, he had dodged a rather ugly death. First, he felt for his presents. All was safe. And then, instead of congratulating himself and taking breath, he hurried homewards, on foot, which proved that his mind had lost control a bit, thinking only how disappointed the wife and children would have been if anything had happened. Another thing he realized, oddly enough, was that he no longer really loved his wife, but had only a great affection for her. What made him think of that? Heaven only knows. But he did think of it. He was an honest man without pretense. This came as a discovery somehow. He turned a moment and saw the crowd gathered about the entangled taxicabs, policemen's helmets gleaming in the lights of the shop windows, then hurried on again. His thoughts full of the joy his presence would give, of the scampering children, and of his wife, bless her silly heart, eyeing the mysterious parcels. And, though he could never explain how, he presently stood at the door of the jail-like building that contained his flat, having walked the whole 3 miles. His thoughts had been so busy and absorbed that he had hardly noticed the length of weary trudge. Besides, he reflected, thinking of the narrow escape, I've had a nasty shock. It was a damn near thing, now I come to think of it. He still felt a bit shaky and bewildered, yet, at the same time, he felt extraordinarily jolly and light-hearted. He counted his Christmas parcels, hugged himself in anticipatory joy, and let himself in swiftly with his latchkey. I'm late, he realized, but when she sees the brown paper parcel, she'll forget to say a word. God bless the old faithful soul. And he softly used the key a second time and entered his flat on tiptoe. In his mind was the master impulse of that afternoon, the pleasure those Christmas presents would give his wife and children. He heard a noise. He hung up hat and coat in the poky vestibule, and they never called it a hall, and moved softly towards the parlour door, holding the packages behind him. Only of them he thought, not of himself, of his family, that is, not of the packages. Pushing the door cunningly ajar, he peeped in shyly. To his amazement, the room was full of people. He withdrew quickly, wondering what it meant. A party? And without his knowing about it? Extraordinary. Keen disappointment came over him, but as he stepped back, the vestibule he saw was full of people too. He was uncommonly surprised, yet somehow not surprised at all. People were congratulating him. There was a perfect mob of them. Moreover, he knew them all, vaguely remembered them at least, and they all knew him. Isn't it a game? Laughed someone, patting him on the back. They haven't the least idea. And the speaker, it was old John Palmer, the bookkeeper at the office, emphasized the they. Not the least idea, he answered with a smile, saying something he didn't understand. Yet he knew he was right. His face apparently showed the utter bewilderment he felt. The shock of the collision had been greater than he realized, evidently. His mind was wandering. Possibly. Only the odd thing was, he'd never felt so clear-headed in his life. 10,000 things grew simple suddenly, but how thickly these people pressed about him, and how familiarly. My parcels, he said, joyously pushing his way across the throng. These are Christmas presents I've brought for them. He nodded toward the room. I've saved for weeks, stopped cigars and billiards and several other good things to buy them. Good man, said Palmer with a happy laugh. It's the heart that counts. Mudbury looked at him. Palmer had said an amazing truth, only people would hardly understand and believe him, would they? Eh? He asked, feeling stuffed and stupid, muddled somewhere between 2 meanings, one of which was gorgeous and the other stupid beyond belief. If you please, Mr. Mudbury, step inside. They're expecting you, said a kindly, pompous voice, and turning sharply, he met the gentle, foolish eyes of Sir James Epiphany, a director of the bank where he worked. The effect of the voice was instantaneous from long habit. "They are." He smiled from his heart, and advanced as from the custom of many years. Oh, how happy and gay he felt! His affection for his wife was real. Romance indeed had gone, but he needed her, and she needed him, and the children, Millie, Bill, and Jean. He deeply loved them. Life was worth living indeed. In the room was a crowd, but an astounding silence. John Mudbury looked around him. He advanced towards his wife, who sat in the corner armchair with Millie on her knee. A lot of people talked and moved about. Momentarily, the crowd increased. He stood in front of them, in front of Millie and his wife, and he spoke, holding out his packages. "It's Christmas Eve," he whispered shyly, "and I brought you something. Something for everybody. Look." He held the packages before their eyes. Of course," said a voice behind them, "but you may hold them out like that for a century. They'll never see them." "Of course they won't, but I love to do the old sweet thing," replied John Mudbury, then wondered with a gasp of stark amazement why he said it. "I think," whispered Millie, staring round her. "Well, what do you think?" her mother asked sharply. "You're always thinking something odd." "I think," the girl continued dreamily, "that Daddy's already here." She paused, then added with a child's impossible conviction, "I'm sure he is. I feel him." There was an extraordinary laugh. Sir James Epiphany laughed. The others, the whole crowd of them, also turned their heads and smiled. But the mother, thrusting the child away from her, rose up suddenly with a violent start. Her face had turned to chalk. She stretched her arms out into the air before her. She gasped and shivered. There was anguish in her eyes. "Look," repeated John, "these are the presents that I brought." But his voice apparently was soundless, and with a spasm of icy pain, he remembered that Palmer and Sir James, some years ago, had died. "It's magic," he cried, "but I love you, Ginny. I love you, and I've always been true to you, as true as steel. We need each other. Oh, can't you see? We go on together, you and I, forever and ever." "Think," interrupted an exquisitely tender voice. "Don't shout. They can't hear you now." And turning, John Mudbury met the eyes of Everard Minturn, their president of the year before. Minturn had gone down with the Titanic. He dropped his parcels then. His heart gave an enormous leap of joy. He saw her face, the face of his wife, look through him. But the child gazed straight into his eyes. She saw him. The next thing he knew was that he heard something tinkling far, far away. It sounded miles below him, inside him. He was sounding himself, all utterly bewildering, like a bell. It was a bell. Millie stooped down and picked the parcels up. Her face shone with happiness and laughter. But a man came in soon after. A man with a ridiculous solemn face, a pencil and a notebook. He wore a dark blue helmet. Behind him came a string of other men. They carried something. He couldn't see exactly what it was. But when he pressed forward through the laughing throng to gaze upon it, he dimly made out 2 eyes, a nose, a chin, a deep red smear, and a pair of folded hands upon an overcoat. A woman's form fell down upon them, and he heard soft sounds of children weeping strangely, and other sounds, as of familiar voices laughing gaily. "They'll join us presently. It goes like a flash." And turning with great happiness in his heart, he saw that Sir James had said it, holding Palmer by the arm as with some natural yet unexpected love of sympathetic friendship. "Come on," said Palmer, smiling like a man who accepts a gift in universal fellowship. "Let's help them. They'll never understand. Still, we can always try." The entire throng moved up with laughter and amusement. It was a moment of hearty, genuine life at last. Delight and joy and peace were everywhere. Then John Mudbury realized the truth. that he was dead.
You might be one of those people like me who doesn't like the stories to be interrupted with ads. And this podcast has ads on it. However, there is a solution. If you would like access to the stories without ads and a link to a library of all the stories I've ever done that you can download without ads, you can get that by becoming a patron. So if you join for $5 or the equivalent in your currency a month, you can have all the stories ad-free. So consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/Barcud, Barcud.
So that was a short story transitioned by Algernon Blackwood. Not the best title either. I think I might have to subtitle it A Christmas Ghost Story. But he wasn't interested in marketing. He was interested in telling stories that said something. Fair play to Algernon. It's not the first we've done of his. We've done a few of his stories. Not yet done the Willows or the Wendigo. I probably will do the Willows first. Not sure about the Wendigo. But I've done Descent into Egypt. I've done The Man Whom the Trees Loved. Maybe done some other stuff, but Blackwood's well known to the channel anyway, and so he should be as well. Let's say something about his bio. So Algernon Blackwood, born 1869 into a wealthy family. He was the son of a former playboy known as Beauty Blackwood, who'd undergone a radical transformation during the Crimean War, becoming a deeply conservative and evangelical Christian. This austere upbringing spurred Algernon the son to rebel, leading him towards mysticism and involvement with magic, such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was an occult group whose members included Bram Stoker, Arthur Machen, Aleister Crowley, MacGregor Mathers, a ton of people who were interested in the occult, really, and Western ritual magic. So he was a big traveller, so he spent a lot of time in Canada and the USA, and he worked on a whole bunch of jobs, from dairy farming to bartending. Was he actually? I think he was a logger as well. Anyway, this is his experience in Canada leads to such stories as the Wendigo, and I guess I'm not sure about his time on the Danube, but certainly the Willows is set there. So he was an extensive traveller, you know. He came back to England in 1899 at the age of 30 and began to be a writer. His first collection of short stories was published in 1906. And what we got is he writes three kinds of stories, really. Ghost stories like this, and as a subtext on that really is his I'm going to say something about this, possibly repeat myself, about the mundane, the everyday ordinary blokes. We did another story of his, The Empty House, which is very much like that. Ordinary people getting involved in the supernatural. So the supernatural and the very ordinary. And if you think about the descent of the high Gothic castles in foreign places with nobility and all sorts of stuff, very turned up, and we get to sort of Blackwood, one of the possibly the first people to really write your ordinary, which later become a hallmark of the 20th century and later end up in such movies as The Conjuring and stuff like that, where it's all about ordinary suburban people. You know, the Gothic had started off not being about ordinary situations. So he writes ghost stories. He writes weird fiction and strange stories. We'll talk a little bit about his cosmic horror type thing. So, and if you listen to Descent into Egypt and The Man Whom the Trees Loved, which are both quite long stories, what you find is they're pretty philosophical and they're mystical, and they discuss or they bring out Blackwood's deeply felt spiritual life as well, and his understanding of the world as a spiritual place. I'm probably going to say something about this now rather than leave it. We have, if we think of Lovecraft, who is writing slightly later, but a big crossover with Blackwood, and we think of Arthur Machen, who's a generation, couple of decades before, really, although they were all alive at the same time. And then we have Lovecraft's cosmic horror, which is about these huge, inhuman creatures, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and Nyarlathotep to a lesser extent, because he's kind of humanized a bit, as Athoth and all of these who these represent. I think it's no surprise that Lovecraft was deeply interested in science fiction and science, because at that time what had happened had been that Western culture had unshackled itself to a large degree from its Christian foundation and taken on Enlightenment ideas, and was preferring a scientific explanation of the universe rather than a religious explanation of the universe. And that led to this machine, what they call it, the blind watchmaker makes it, and it's a machine that just goes on and on forever, has no meaning, no purpose, just mechanistic. And if you take that, our significance as creatures, where we had been the favoured creatures of God, if you think about that, Adam and Eve, and then science comes along, and Darwin comes and says, you're just another animal, really. You're just another kind of monkey. And then Freud comes along and says, your intellect, and you think this intellect is super duper duper. It's actually not. It's undermined by the unconscious, by these primal drives towards sexuality and all sorts. So, and science appeared to be dethroning humanity from its central place as in the universe. And so Lovecraft comes along and goes, yeah, do you know what? There's these huge titanic forces, which are kind of like gods, and they don't care a hoot about you. They'll step on you like a bug. And that's kind of Lovecraft's horrific, our utter pointlessness, our existential. It's like an existential dread, isn't it? We are. And at the same time, you have, the French existentialists, Camus and Sartre and people like that. With this thing that we mean nothing. We are thrown meaningless. We wake meaningless. Heidegger as well, potentially, into this universe, and we are without purpose. And so that leads to this existential dread. Now, let's look at Blackwood's take on that, which is that he is not cosmic. He's not looking at the stars. His people move in natural landscapes, either in the man whom the trees loved, or the willows, etc., or the Wendigo, in these open, wild landscapes where there's this force, an elemental force that's neither good nor bad, but it doesn't care about us. It's nature, but it is alive, and it's at least partially sentient, and at least partially purposeful. It has a purpose, and that's kind of like Blackwood's. I was thinking about Arthur Machen as well. He's like the Great God Pan, the white people, the Shining Pyramid. They live in this mystical world of unsettling creatures whose motives we have no knowledge of, and therefore we can't control, and therefore we can't make safe. And that's another version of this existential dread, that we are weak and the prey of great powers who, unlike the Christian God, don't love us, these things. They don't care about us. They're not out to get us in many cases. They just don't care about us. So I think that's how Blackwood fits into this cosmic horror, existential dread type thing. But he, at least, like Machen, I suppose, allows for some transcendence of this, and there may be, by assimilating ourselves or coming to understand or seeing our real place in the natural world, for for Blackwood, there may be some kind of succor there, some help there. Anyway, I was saying about his biography. He was a guy. Anyway, another thing I've got not to do is refer to people who write nasty things. So I'm not going to talk about that. So so Blackwood, he then got involved in the TV, and he read a ghost story on the BBC's first ever television program, broadcast from Alexandra Palace in 1936. Yeah, 2nd November 1936. His sonorous voice and compelling delivery on both radio and television earned him the moniker the Ghost Man. And he was still writing up to his death in 1982. Let's look at this particular story, Transition. It's a short story published in December 1913, clearly a Christmas ghost story, in the New Witness, a weekly journal edited by Cecil Chesterton. It was later reprinted in his own collection, 10-minute stories, the next year in 1914, published by John Murray. And there were 50 short stories, each designed to be read in approximately 10 minutes. So he does write very long stories as well. Mostly his stories are really long. And So transition, yeah, it's the mundane. It's just an ordinary Joe. You see this. We did a story called "The Underground" by Chetwynd Hayes, and that also is about ordinary people. And I think that's its strength, that he's not very special. He's bought cheap presents, presumably because that's all he can afford. He's not doing particularly well in the world, and yet he's not an unsympathetic character. He is perhaps, we're going to get gunned down here, but he is perhaps characteristic of that stage in a relationship where you've been with somebody for a long time, and that kind of passionate stuff has waned a little, but you have a deep love for them still, and you care for them, and that, he says, the romance has maybe died, but he clearly deeply cares for his wife, and has brought these things with no other aim than to please. There's no side to him. There's no manoeuvring. He just wants to make her happy, and the same for the kids, and how much he loves his 3 kids. So this is every man. And in a sense, I want to say, and maybe stretching beyond the text here, but it seems to me to be a celebration of the ordinary man or woman who's living an ordinary life, who does it with good heart, does their job sincerely well. They're not super duper top of the pie, whatever, crust. They're not, but they're just a minor person in a bank in this case, but they are still valuable and worthwhile. And I think that is certainly one message of this story, that the ordinary life of an everyday person who is nothing special, is still really valuable because it's embedded in a network of love and care for people. And I think we saw this coming, really, that he was actually dead, because we've seen The Sixth Sense, so we know, and we've read Russell Kirk's Saviour Gate, and if you haven't, go and listen to it now on the channel. It's a good Christmas ghost story. So, yes. So, ghost stories, Christmas ghost stories. You can tell I've lost my thread. Hang on a second. Yes. What I was saying is, even those who are dead are very genial and affable. And basically their message is, life's over in a flash. Don't worry, they'll be with us soon, and then we'll continue with our party, because everybody's really happy in the afterlife. And I think this reflects Blackwood's faith in a spiritual dimension to life. So is that all I want to say about it? Let me just see if there's any. I made extensive notes, but I haven't used them all. The tension, we saw it coming. I think the problem is we've read too many books, seen too many plays, I think that's a Lou Reed quote, and we know what's going to come. We know he did die. But the Crowd by Ray Bradbury's a little bit like that as well. There's another thing, urban alienation. Blackwood was really interested in urban alienation. This is a man who loves the natural world, who believes in the power of the natural world. And clearly, he's probably not going to like the mundanity of ordinary urban life. So fair enough. But I didn't think that was a massively strong one. The only other thing I want to link it to, as I often do, is Mark Fisher's. You probably realise there are a couple of people who were a massive influence on me and my thinking. Certainly one's Carl Jung. The other is Mark Fisher. I wonder how they would have got on. So Mark Fisher, sadly, ended his life in 2017. I think as time goes on, people will realise what a genius he was, what a sharp thinker he was. But certainly he talks about, in his book, The Weird and the Eerie, he talks about things that unsettle us, and one of them is the eerie. And the eerie is about an agent. So somebody or something has a purpose. And if we know what that purpose is, and we can predict what they're going to do, and we can manage how we get on with them, and ensure that we don't get gobbled up or squashed, then that feels a bit safe. That's not eerie. But where the purpose is unknown, that creates this eeriness. What on earth is this all about? And that creates great anxiety, because if we don't know, there's an agent out there that has a purpose, and we don't know what it wants, and it seems very powerful, and oh goodness, that's scary. Yeah. And I think that's how that's another flip side of it's perhaps closer to the fear found in cosmic horror than, in fact, I said existentialist dread, which I think it arises from our meaninglessness. Um, so let's think about that. We I'm not like this, but for many people in the 20th and 21st century, I think they are. They feel purposeless and meaningless, and they wake up in the world that they have no idea what's going on, what they're doing here, what they're supposed to do, or what the end will be, other than it won't be, it'll end up with them leaving the world. And they have no conception of how or when that'll happen. For most of us, for most of our lives, we don't. And so that meaninglessness is awful, and that is to do with our scientific worldview and the fact we've removed the spiritual. This is my view: the spiritual from. So, if we have a world that is just a machine made of bits that go on for no reason, that doesn't make people happy. Most of us don't like that. We feel really unpleasantly unhappy and drained from that. So that's our existential dread. And then if we look around, the world is meaningless. But goodness me, these things seem to happen. We have viruses, we have floods, we have earthquakes. There are comets that might strike, or meteors that might strike the Earth. There are lots of drones flying around, and nobody knows somebody does, who's piloting them, but I quite like that. That's like the killer clowns. I love those as well. But, because that's eerie, isn't it? The drones are eerie. What do they want? There is a purpose. They appear to be purposeful, but what do they want? Anyway, I hope I haven't gone on too much, but I think this idea of the eerie and of our, if you take that view of our meaninglessness, which I don't, and I don't think Blackwood did either. Blackwood clearly didn't, not in this story. It's a very hopeful story, I think. But if you put them together, you get the eerie. I think the eerie, Mark Fisher's understanding of the eerie is really a key to turning a lock. Anyway, that's it. Another Christmas story, a short one. I've blethered longer than the story. Somebody will comment on that. Honestly, they will. And I say to you, feel the quality. Never mind the width. Never mind the quality. Feel the width. That's what they used to say, wasn't it? But feel the quality. It's a sweet little story, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you're hungry for more stories, remember I've just put out a massive 12-hour plus compilation of 22 ghost stories for Christmas. So if you are not yet satisfied and you go no, and you're stamping your little feet and you're banging your little fist on the table, and I want more stories. Guess what? I've got them for you. 22 Christmas ghost stories, 12 hours of it. I've got lots of long compilations for you just to doze off to. If that is your wont. Anyway, I think I've got one more before Christmas. I don't know what I'm going to do. I might do a Dickens. Probably should. Anyway, ta-ta.